My name is Average Joe, and I'm a proud geek with expertise in movies, superheroes, and animation.
My name is Beef Pork Ribs. I'm a fine repository of esoteric knowledge, which I suppose most people would qualify as geeky. Though I dabble in many fandoms, my main areas of expertise are anime, movies, and Belgian comics, with a strong recent insurgency of D&D.
Our mission is to bring nerd and geek culture to the masses
by sticking it all under the microscope.
Welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast.
Movies, comics, graphic novels, TV, cartoons, animation, nerds are geeks, entertainment culture. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power. Nerds and geeks, come gather around the scene. Come and join us in the Bat Jar. Come and tune into Average Joe and his team. Lots of room here in the Bat Jar. When the newest nerdy news drops, these podcast pals put it under the scope. DC, Marvel, Disney, Star Wars, cinematic multiverses. Bat Jar, Nerdy Power.
Hello there, and welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast, where we put nerd and geek culture under the microscope. This indeed will be the one episode to rule them all. Beef Pork Ribs, we have assembled a fellowship of not 11 or however many there are in the book, but we've assembled quite the group of people today to talk about the Lord of the Rings. Are you ready, Beef Pork Ribs?
So long as we do indeed in the darkness bind all episodes together, I think we can handle it.
First of all, as I said, we do have a lot of people on the show today. We have myself, Beef Pork Ribs, Ben the Movie Buff. Jump in and say hello to people.
Hey, how are you? I will join this podcast, but I do not know the way.
And returning, we have one returning guest and two new people, and we should really introduce our new guests first, and this is a segment of the show we always do called New Guest, Who Dis? So first, I want to welcome someone who I've wanted to have on the show for a while now, but this is the first opportunity to have her. We have Libra, the Book Lady.
Hello, everyone.
So Libra, the Book Lady, what kind of nerd or geek are you?
Well, easiest thing is that I'm a book nerd. I have always been reading books ever since I was a kid. Honestly, if there's something that comes out as far as geek culture, it's like, okay, is there a book I can read? If there's a movie coming out, it's like, okay, got to read the book beforehand. That's me in a nutshell.
And what kind of nerd or geek would you like to be?
I think I would like to be the kind that embraces all kinds of nerd and geek culture and is open to whatever is good.
I like it. Very altruistic. Well, Libra the Book Lady, or LTBL, that sounds like a lot of letters. I'll just call you Libra the Book Lady. Thank you for being here. We also have another new guest, Rune on the podcast.
Hey, how's it going? I guess I should have thought of something fancy to say.
Well, Rune, you've got the rest of this episode to think of clever things to say. What kind of nerd or geek are you?
I think I would probably describe myself as something of a jack of all trades. I like to dabble in a lot of things, a few specialties, Lord of the Rings, obviously, Star Wars, Lego, but I like to dabble. I know a bit about comics, a bit about various franchises, Harry Potter, Star Trek. I enjoy a little bit of writing, a bit of movie watching, a bit of Lego building, lots of different things, I'd say.
Okay, so you're a real, you wouldn't say you're a master of any of these things.
Well, I'd say Lord of the Rings is probably about as close as I get to mastership. I'd say I'm a 4th level apprentice.
Okay, I'm sure you might have that title challenged in this episode, but that's okay.
Bring it on.
What kind of nerd or geek would you want to be?
At the moment, I'm happy with where I'm at. I just wish I had more time to develop things, particularly writing. I enjoy writing a good story, but I rarely have the time or the ability to get to it. So that would be something I'd love to develop in more.
Fair enough. Well, we're glad to have you on the show, Rune Reimer. And that has been new guest, Who Dis? And we also have somebody who has been on the show for the first time very recently back with us. So in our segment, What You Been Doing? Shaggy Neo, tell us, what kind of nerdy or geeky things have you been up to?
Well, it hasn't been a super long time since I was on last, but have had the opportunity to continue my nerddom around American Ninja Warrior. There's a new show started last year called The Titan Games with Dwayne Johnson, which I feel like also has the benefit of overlapping with a Disney fandom that you're big on, Average Joe, of Moana. So he was Maui in that show as so yeah, I got into the Titan games the last little while, critiquing all of the biomechanics because I'm that kind of geek. Hasn't been too long, so I haven't gotten up to too much, but that's one thing.
All right. Well, we're glad to have you as part of this episode as well. I joked about being a fellowship, but truly, we're going somewhere together, and I think that's the point of the fellowship in the story. So that was what you've been doing. Very short this week, and every time we talk about a franchise or a particular topic for the first time, we always do our secret origin segment, or SOS, which shows how every person on the show was first introduced to that. So, Beef Fork Ribs, as the regular co host of the show, we'll start with you. How were you first introduced to the Lord of the Rings franchise?
So there's a odd answer to that, because I don't actually remember which one of these three things came first. Um, so at some point, I read The Hobbit, which is a pretty common introduction into the Lord of the Rings franchise, as it's a pretty popular children's book. Um, which was an odd thing for me because I'd had difficulty picking up English as my second language. And But once I started getting better at it, it was definitely reading that helped me quite a bit. And The Hobbit was the first book that I read that wasn't a kind of like introduction slash reading, learning how to read book. I did, however, also watch the old um, Hobbit animated movie, and I can't remember if that was before or after, which kind of also introduced me to other things. And I still to this day picture Gollum more like a frog uh, than uh, than what he looks like in the movies because of that, because of the animated movie. Um, I suppose it's got to be one of those two that happened first, but that's The Hobbit, technically, not Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings, I remember distinctly. This did actually happen later, so it's not my first introduction, but it's my first introduction to Lord of the Rings proper. Was that my sister, who was at the time studying medieval studies, made a project about Lord of the Rings and specifically the influences of Scandinavian literature on Lord of the Rings, and she talked about it a lot and reread it as a result of this, and talked to me a lot about it and convinced me to actually read it. So that's how I got introduced to it, and then later on, already having liked it, we got the movies and have watched all three movies extended edition at least every 2 years for the last 12 years, I think, at least, if that's possible. Well, it's at least the last 10 years, so yeah.
Well, I guess I was about 12 years old when the Fellowship of the Ring movie came out. Now, I had heard of the books, but I never got around to reading them. I had friends when I was younger who were obsessed with the books. So when the first movie came out, I knew that they were really excited, and I was too, hearing what they had told me about it. Now, apparently, I was a kind of sensitive child as I was growing up, and my parents didn't think I was quite ready for Fellowship of the Ring when it first came out. So I unfortunately did not get the chance to see it in theaters. But when it came out on DVD about 5 or 6 months later, I was begging them to watch it. So we sat down and we watched The Fellowship of the Ring, and that was the movie that basically inspired me to want to be a filmmaker today. It inspired me to become a movie buff. It inspired me to work in film, and there are lots of movies that I love. And at that time, being a young guy, like, I'd watched a lot of Disney movies. I'd seen the Star Wars original trilogy more times than I could count. But Fellowship of the Ring was the one movie that made me realize what I wanted to do with my life. So really, in a way, it's kind of, that movie is possibly the most influential movie I've ever seen. And then obviously it just got me salivating for when The Two Towers and Return of the King would eventually come out.
So I actually got introduced to Lord of the Rings when I was in high school. Good nerdy child that I was really good friends with the librarian, and she I'd asked her for something interesting to read, and this was before the movies had come out. I don't even think they'd been officially announced yet. And she's just like, you know what? There's this like kind of weird fantasy trilogy you might be interested in, and went into like the dark recesses of the library and found it, and lent it, like obviously lent it out to me. I blazed through it and just, yeah, utterly changed my life. And read the Silmarillion very soon after that. And actually, my first two copies of those books are the ones from that library that I first read, because it was about a year later they announced the movies and we were getting all new copies for the library. So she was just told me that you love them so much, more than anybody else I've shown them to, you can have the original copies. Like, they're not first editions, but these books are older than I am. They're from the early 80s, and I still have them today. And I read The Hobbit shortly after that, and ever since then I just like I got out like all of my books today, like that are all Tolkien, and there's a stack of probably about a dozen books or so. Some of them are repeats. I do have two different versions of the Silmarillion and the 50th anniversary edition of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, all in one set. Yeah, kind of a lifelong love affair that I've had with these books, and yeah, they've definitely changed my life as well.
My dad had a copy of both The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit in his bookshelf in the basement, and my older brother was a big, big reader, and he started reading them. And me, being a younger brother, thought that everything my older brother did was cool, so I was mildly interested in what he was telling me about these cool books he was reading. And then I believe he discovered at the library the animated version of The Hobbit from the 70s, made for TV movie. And we watched that. And then I think at some point we also watched animated version of the first half of The Lord of the Rings. I think came out in the 80s. And they are both enough that between that and pressure from my brother, I eventually read both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings before I was 12, I think, and just could not get enough of it from there. I've probably read both of them as well as the other books by Tolkien. Oof, I've lost count, to be honest, so many times. Hugely influenced the way I see fiction, the way I see fantasy, and yeah, to the point where I now have 4 or 5 shelves full of Tolkien's books. He didn't write too much, but I have probably about 20 copies of The Lord of the Rings, and various other bits and bobs as well. But yeah, ironically, it was through a questionably made animated, made for TV movie that got me into it.
Rune Reimer, I gotta say, I am so impressed that your introduction to Lord of the Rings was those animated features, and you still survived. So I laughed out loud when you said that was one of your first exposures. It's like, oh man, I've watched them as well, and they're just they're great on certain levels and just so cringeworthy on others. So for me, I actually got introduced. I'm pretty sure like my mom read us The Hobbit when we were like too young to be reading it ourselves. Like we weren't able to read it. Our reading level wasn't there yet. Um, but then I really got into it when my sister was given The Lord of the Rings as a birthday gift. Um, and I actually read the book 3 times before she finished it. Um, I remember where her bookmark was. It was on page 133, and I passed that bookmark 3 times over like the next couple of years, and just fell in love with the land of Middle Earth, with so many of the noble characters, the high fantasy, the epic, stories that span eons and centuries and millennia. Um, it really, I would say, defined my taste in literature. To this day, I really enjoy picking up an epic fantasy novel or two. Opened me up to that whole world. Well, as we get into it, it opened up the whole world to that whole world. So Yeah, that's me with Lord of the Rings. I also read it at a very early age, and just haven't been able to put it down since.
I think you said that your first email account was related to
Yeah,
Lord
I
of the
forgot.
Rings.
Yeah, I guess I can admit that for posterity here, it'll exist permanently online in this podcast. My first email address I ever had was tolkienfreak@hotmail.com. I like to think that I've matured a little bit, but also that I'm still the same guy. Yeah, Tolkien had a big influence on me, and Lord of the Rings was the gateway to all of that.
So it's very good that all of you have such a deep and passionate history and relationship with this franchise because I, for whatever reason, have never really gotten into Lord of the Rings. I can remember being at my family's campground on a rainy day in like 2002 watching The Fellowship of the Ring on VHS. And I distinctly think that was my first exposure to Lord of the Rings. I was probably 11 years old. And I just, the story was too complicated for me. I couldn't really follow it. It was a little scary for me at the time. And so I never really fell in love with the franchise. And as I've gotten older, I've encountered more and more people like each of you who have some deep connection to this franchise. And so while I am not myself a huge fan, I can acknowledge that it is a quality product and that it indeed can inspire the same kind of love and admiration that I have for other franchises. Very short for myself, but there you go. That has been our secret origin segment for The Lord of the Rings. Now, for people who don't know anything about The Lord of the Rings, this is kind of meant to be an introduction to the concept of this franchise. We're not going to be getting into any real discussion about the film adaptations, which most people would be more familiar with, perhaps. More so getting into the significance of The Lord of the Rings as a franchise, and of course, its origin as a book series. And so, getting into a bit of the history here, this is kind of where I'm really relying on internet sources and you guys to chime in. A couple of you have already kind of made reference to the fact that The Lord of the Rings is essentially a sequel to The Hobbit, which was a book that was first published in 1937. And even though The Hobbit is marketed as a children's book, The Lord of the Rings became more of a, I guess you would say, like maybe a young adult or just straight up adult fantasy fiction book. So, my first question here for all of you, was it always his intention to make a more mature sequel to The Hobbit?
It's really interesting how The Hobbit actually wasn't really initially intended to have so many overtones of the larger Middle Earth uh, arc, but that had been a storyline that Tolkien had been working on for decades before he wrote The Hobbit. So it kind of forced its way in there. And so Lord of the Rings, in some sense, is older than The Hobbit because it really grounds itself in the Middle Earth world to a larger extent and brings in more of the lore and the history. So he wasn't intending it as a sequel per se initially. It was just part of his larger mythology. But then when The Hobbit really took off and people wanted something that connected to the Hobbit story, he brought in all of this extra work he'd already been doing to flesh out the landscape and really bring it to life.
Well, if it's all right, Joe, can we jump back a little bit from The Hobbit to what people nowadays know as what's in the Silmarillion? Because that's where it began. The Hobbit was released in the published in the 30s, but as early as the 1914 or so, Tolkien had been beginning to write a mythology for languages that he was creating. He was an Oxford professor of language, and he, in his hobby time, would create his own languages. And part of that process was he didn't want to just create a language. He wanted to create a mythology, a history, a whole world behind that language. So he was working on that from the 19 teens up until the point when he wrote The Hobbit. And while he's writing The Hobbit, he kind of slowly hints a little bit here and there of this greater mythology, kind of unintentionally, because he wrote The Hobbit initially just as a story for his own children. And then once The Hobbit was published and it was a big success, and the publishers were really hounding him to create a sequel, and he started writing the sequel, he really realized that like this was an opportunity for him to kind of create more of his world. And so you could say that The Lord of the Rings is more a sequel to the Silmarillion than it is to The Hobbit, even though chronologically both happened before The Lord of the Rings. But he kind of made it initially as a sequel to The Hobbit, but then he kind of realized this is how I can tie in my large mythology and kind of bring it down into a more relatable, I guess you might say, point of view, and kind of tie all the threads of his mythology into a conclusion.
The name's Average Joe. You're new here, so I will forgive your missaying my name. But
Well, Joe, people often will shorten full names. For instance, I have heard you on this very podcast refer to beef pork ribs as BPR. So, I'm just following precedent here.
if you want to shorten my name, you can call me AJ. I'll accept that.
So there's a few things like that I wanted to touch on just related to this. We've mentioned how The Hobbit is kind of the first one that was released, and then it took 20 years for him to come up with a sequel. And like the fact that he'd been working on all of these languages and the Silmarillion without even realizing it. It's kind of phenomenal that they even allowed him to publish in the first place. The Hobbit was given to the publisher's son, who read it, and he was a 10-year-old kid, and he was just like, yeah, this is pretty fun. We should talk to this guy and get more from him. And they had to wait 20 years, and he gave them this tome, and he wanted it published all in one book. And they looked at him and said, there's no way we can do this all in one. People won't buy it. So we'll split it up. And he was furious because he was a perfectionist, and kind of the image of a crotchety old professor that you have in the back of your mind, that was Tolkien. He was one of those finicky, obsessed, perfective, kind of miserable, crotchety old man. But these languages that he created and then wrote the mythologies for, a lot of it, yes, he was writing during World War One, and I think he was injured at the Battle of the Somme and sent home. And so while he was writing all of this stuff, he still had all those images from the Great War in the back of his mind. But there was also a lot of influence from where he grew up, in like the specific town he grew up. There were trains that would go by that had the names of Welsh towns on them, and just the look of those words inspired him in the languages that he would end up creating.
Yeah, the one thing I thought to bring to this part is something. So for myself, again, my sister knows a lot more about Tolkien, and she's actually studied Lord of the Rings, and as a medievalist, that text does still bear some influence, or is a sign of some influence from the medieval period on literature. But one of the things I do remember, because I have taken to doing some writing of fantasy, was she sent me, when I was feeling a little discouraged, this part of a letter that Tolkien sent to his publisher, saying that there were parts of the story that he didn't know. Like he knew, like I can't remember exactly, but more or less saying like the council of Elrond was something he discovered with the story, that there were so many parts of it, even though he had, which I think feeds into what we were saying, that he had this grand idea, but the books were specifically a way to ground those into an actual story, and to like have he said there were parts of it that he didn't know he was going to write, because I think too often people are like, he spent years and years perfecting the story, and then suddenly Lord of the Rings just came out and it was already pre-done. But it's more that, and there is this kind of thing where it's like people have, there's a memes about how he wrote The Hobbit and then created an entire history backstory, and several thousand years worth of history and mythology to justify it, but it really is the other way around, that he had all of the history and the backstory and everything, and then from that he was able to create Lord of the Rings. Um, but it wasn't a fully fleshed out story yet. It was an idea of how he could bring all of this to a conclusion. So you know kind of to bring that to the answer of your question, did he really think it would be something so big and serious? I don't think so. I think he was very much surprised as to what he was able to do, but at the same time probably felt like it was something he kind of needed to exercise out of himself, because I don't know. I know from personal experience, world building is the part of writing I like the most, but then actually writing the story is very hard, but can be very liberating in some ways to say, now everything I've built actually has a purpose.
You got a lot of enthusiasts in here when the hands are going up while everybody else is talking. I want to thank Libra, the book lady, for pointing out that Tolkien never intended it to be a trilogy, and so that's just as a kind of a pre-movie purist of sorts. I hate it when people call it a trilogy because he wrote one book and then they forced him to break it up into three. So I think that just bears noting as we talk about the origin of the book series, is that he actually wrote a book that they then forced him to break up into a series.
No, he wasn't injured in the battle. He got ill while he was in the trenches. He didn't write a full background and then write the story around it. It was an ongoing process. When he started writing The Lord of the Rings, he had The Hobbit written, and he had a version of what we would now call the Silmarillion, but he didn't really have a lot of connecting threads to how those events got to this time, and he didn't know anything about the ring when he started writing the Lord of the Rings. And it was a continual process for him to, as he was writing, to kind of figure out the landscape of Middle Earth as it was in the story, because the Silmarillion takes place in a land that was mostly flooded and destroyed by the time the Lord of the Rings comes along, and it's only like hinted at. It's a far back history by that point, and so while he's writing the Lord of the Rings, he's kind of coming up with all these ideas of how that mythology, that history builds into all this. And he comes up as well with the concept of the ring and what the ring all means, because something that a lot of people might not remember or realize is that when The Hobbit was first published, Gollum intends to give the ring to Bilbo. Gollum isn't mad at Bilbo because he stole the ring. He's embarrassed that he can't find the ring to give to Bilbo because Bilbo won the contest. And then when Tolkien was writing the Lord of the Rings, he realized, oh, what Gollum did doesn't work with what I'm coming up with, this idea of the ring. So he actually had to go back, and in the second and following editions of The Hobbit, Chapter 5, Riddles in the Dark, is rewritten. I have an anniversary copy of The Hobbit that has the original chapter published in it. It's very interesting to read. So one of the things Tolkien is really known for is going back and revising his stories and tweaking it and changing it a little bit. And The Lord of the Rings reflects a process of that. Like originally when he wrote it, Aragorn, the guy who becomes king at the end, he's a hobbit named Trotter. And like many things, as he's going, he's discovering what he's going to write, and he tweaks it and changes it constantly.
Whenever somebody would come to him with a seeming contradiction between his characters or something that had happened that he'd already written and something that happens later on, they would come to him and say, "Oh, look, this actually contradicts this." He wouldn't say, "Oh, I'll fix that." He would say to them, "I'll go and find out why it seems that way." It was like this story was being given to him, and he would just happen. It's the where we get the whole idea of the Red Book of Westmarch, which is the book within the book of the hobbits recording their history of what happened with the War of the Ring. And for Tolkien himself, it was the same kind of idea where this history was being revealed to him, and he was simply recording it. And that's something else that I feel like a lot of people don't understand or maybe aren't aware of, is that the War of the Ring, like the story that we know as the Lord of the Rings, the trilogy, which again, yes, totally agree, not a trilogy, just happens to be published that way because of publishers and not because of writers. The War of the Ring is half of a chapter at the end of the Silmarillion. It's kind of a footnote. And yet it's this 1,000-page saga, this huge like journey, but it's only 13 months in millennia of history within Middle Earth. And it just, what he's created is astronomical. But it was always his intention that people would come later, other artisans and other writers, and be able to flesh out more of the world. A lot of that has been done visually for us with the movies, but a lot of it was also done by his own son Christopher, who published a lot of the rest of the books. Because The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were only published in his lifetime, the Silmarillion and everything else came afterwards.
I'm just curious, Libra, where the idea that he expected other people to build off of his work. Not from what I've heard, I'm not sure that's really a thing that he ever thought.
I don't remember exactly where I heard that. It might have been somewhere that I read. I don't know if it was in any of the official biographies, but that was something I had heard, possibly in an interview with a Tolkien scholar, that they were saying like, yes, perhaps like this, maybe not to change like all of the things that he'd already written, but to give a little bit more life to the different cultures he's created, and also to learn the languages he'd created.
Yeah, I'd never heard that either, but it's just kind of strikes me as consistent with what he was trying to build, which was one of his motivations was that he looked at the British Isles and particularly England and felt like there wasn't really a grounding mythology that the British people, particularly in England, could really rally behind and kind of find their identity in. Whereas a lot of other cultures have like a really well fleshed out mythology that helps ground their identity. Um, and a mythology grows. Other people take up the story and they tell the other tales, and not every bard knows every story from the mythology. To get the full picture, you need many different voices, and some of them don't quite tell the story the same way. So I feel like that would be consistent. It wouldn't surprise me if maybe he wasn't necessarily like intentionally, cultivating people building off his mythology, but I think he would have been pleased by it because that would mean it had taken on that life of a story that could be owned by the people of England and continue to deepen and grow.
I was just gonna say it's I found it was something interesting and may even segue into later parts of the conversation to note that even though it isn't strictly what people have done necessarily, I mean, there are some people who have done so, but when we talk about the influence that Tolkien and specifically Lord of the Rings has had on high fantasy, low fantasy, middle fantasy, just fantasy at large, and also on pulp culture, it is almost like that is what happened. I mean, I don't want to necessarily jump the gun, but when you think about even just the basic races of Dungeons and Dragons, like the elves, the dwarves, the halflings that for copyright reasons can't be called hobbits, but they are hobbits. All of this was kind of influenced pretty basically very directly from him and is kind of a continuation. And if you look at even just in a lot of those stories and a lot of other stories, the way that elves are depicted and dwarves are depicted, it is much closer to Tolkien than to some of the things he was inspired from. And so I do find that it's interesting that, you know, even though not a lot of people would touch Lord of the Rings and that and Middle Earth specifically and try to make something new out of it, I do think that he still, in a different way perhaps than expected, if that was his goal, accomplished that goal of having people reconsider fantasy in a different way and to look at a kind of a way to have a global mythos that we can kind of talk about and use to understand a different genre and to tell stories within it, that may be allegorical but are still just as powerful because there is a kind of shared consciousness of what he's created and what it means in our society.
Yeah, agree 100%. BPR. It's this whole idea of elves and what he's created. We all share that now, and we wouldn't have the fantasy genre at all without him. In what he was trying to create, I think it was Shaggy Neo that said it. He was trying to create a mythology for Britain, because up until that point, the classic British mythology that we all probably know and are at least familiar with is, like, to some respect, is the Arthurian legends, which he hated. They're French. They're not English. They're set in Britain, but they're not British at all. Like, the British Isles themselves are a group of islands that have been conquered, and people moved further and further west as they were conquered and defeated and forced off their lands by various tribes. And all of them were coming from what we would now think of as the Scandinavian region, is like Norway and Finland, and it's those sagas that should have been carried over with the Saxons and the Danes and the Jutes, and pushed out the what we would now call the Welsh, but are the Celts and the Irish and the Picts and all of that. Like, all of that hodgepodge of culture is what is Britain. It's not this French Arthurian chivalry kind of idea. Like, that came much, much later, especially after the Norman conquest. But it's before that. It's the Scandinavians, the Saxons, who really were like Britain. That was the history he was trying to get at, which is why the Icelandic sagas, the Norwegian sagas, the Eddas, like, all of that is what he was basing it on, because he felt that was more British, like, historically speaking, than the Norman French.
Well, he didn't hate the Arthurian legends. He definitely did not hate them. He, in fact, even in one of his many incompleted projects, he even wrote a poem on some of the Arthurian characters. I would say it would be very incorrect to say that he hated them, but he certainly wasn't particularly interested in them. And what he definitely was interested in was the pre-Norman conquest mythologies and written sagas and stuff. But to kind of bring it back around, if we can, AJ, to the question of Tolkien's impact on the genre of fantasy. Well, for one thing, when he was writing it, the concept of a fantasy genre definitely did not exist, and I think many people would say that the Lord of the Rings affected the creation of that genre. Not necessarily straight up, but certainly highly influential. His work, to quote my brother, who I was talking about this recently, my brother said that the Lord of the Rings is both seismic and slight at the same time in terms of how its impact on the modern genre of fantasy has been. Like, seismic, like it's earth-shattering in that pretty much anyone who in the last 50 years who has written a fantasy story has to recognize that the Lord of the Rings exists, and they either have to make the decision, I'm going to try to emulate this, or I'm going to try to do something completely different than this. They can't ignore the fact that it exists. Although, in the same time, pretty much any fantasy work is very different than the Lord of the Rings, in that Tolkien, by virtue of being a professor of language, being a philologist, I think is how you pronounce that, a person who studies languages and how words come about and their meanings and all that. No other fantasy writer has his level of education on that, on the medieval imagination, and on the background. So in the one sense, all fantasy since Tolkien is very different than his, but all fantasy since him is very much affected by him.
Yeah, we've gotten this far into the conversation without even actually giving the full name of the author of The Lord of the Rings. So, John Ronald Reuel, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, Tolkien, commonly referred to as J.R.R. Tolkien, is in fact the author of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. He was born in 1892 and passed away in 1973, so he's been long since passed away. And I think, as we're already discussing here, he clearly is, maybe I'm totally ignorant to this, but he seems very atypical of what you would think of like a writer. He's an accomplished academic who has spent all this time before actually writing anything, developing languages and cultures and kind of the stuff that would normally, as you're reading a book, you would think is like in the background or less important than like the plot or characters. So you can already tell, as this series is so influential, that he himself, I guess, would be an atypical example of your typical writer, and in a way that it sounds like what I'm hearing is that he's not necessarily the creator of the fantasy genre, but he's a major influence on it.
Yeah, I'd say you got the basics down there. Like, he was an academic, and writing was not a form of employment for him. It was a pastime, and I think on some level he was always a little confused uh, about the popularity of the Lord of the Rings and his work in general, and uh, I think you'd be very shocked to see the popularity that the mythology of the Silmarillion has today. Like, he died with the Silmarillion incomplete. He died in 1977. The Lord of the Rings came out in the 50s, and in the 20 years after that, he continually picked away at trying to get the Silmarillion completed. But he died before it was done, and that's a very well known fact about Tolkien, is that he started a lot of things and finished very few. And then when his son, after he died, compiled it together, and there's a very large appreciation for the greater mythology that he created. And I think he would be a little surprised at how much it was, because he always thought it was just kind of a little personal project of his that he didn't really think a lot of people would be interested in. He was, on some level at least, a pretty modest guy.
As a writer, when you study writing and then read Lord of the Rings, you see that he did almost everything wrong. He has all of these characters who, are mentioned maybe once and have no other context. He has these long, long paragraphs of description of landscape that are just, other in any other book would be in very, very boring. But for some reason, the fact that he's doing everything wrong, it doesn't matter. Well, it does matter, but somehow he's able to make it work. And I think that's one of the reasons that people are so fascinated by him. It he's a world builder. He you were saying, like, he starts so many things. He sets things in motion. And yeah, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were, two of the only things that he completed. And even The Hobbit itself was only, like, started as a line that he wrote on the back of someone else's final exam. He was marking papers and he wrote, "In a hobbit there lived a hole," or in a hole there lived a hobbit. And he had no idea what a hobbit was, but that was the word that came to him. And it's just fascinating that he did not set out to do this. He was a philologist. He was a studier of languages. He was involved in writing the Oxford English Dictionary. I think there's a section in the W's that was the section he worked on. And he had no intention of becoming this, seismic, earth shifting kind of writer, especially when he wasn't particularly good at it. But for some reason, people just love the story, and it keeps on being discovered by new generations who still love it.
So, in my ignorance, I thought the Silmarillion was something that Tolkien wrote after the Lord of the Rings to kind of expand the universe and give more context for things that are referred to in the books. Because I know with George Lucas, when he wrote the original script for Star Wars, he also wrote an 18-page backstory to kind of set the stage for like where the plot of the Star Wars script was, and that became the basis for the prequel movies they did. So it sounds like, if I'm hearing you guys correctly, he more or less wrote all the context for his world first before actually writing any of the books. So for people like myself who are totally unfamiliar, can you guys explain like what the Silmarillion actually is?
Ian, you're not completely wrong, AJ, in thinking that he wrote it after the Lord of the Rings. He did. He also wrote it before. He wrote 3 or 4 drafts and versions of it that changed significantly from the original one he wrote in the 19 teens. But the Silmarillion, as far as the final form that we have of it, it's it starts as a creation myth of the world, and then slowly moves into talking about these angelic godlike beings that go into the world, kind of shape the world and govern it, and one of them's evil, and he kind of wrecks everything that everyone else does. And then the elves come, and then later the men come, and they have interactions in this primordial world that slowly, and there's all these climactic epic battles and events between the various elven peoples and the evil Dark Lord. And then by the time the Lord of the Rings comes along, all the events of the Silmarillion are 1,000 to 6,000 years in the past. So the Silmarillion is it's kind of on the one sense a creation myth. It's kind of a back history. It's kind of it's in many ways it's its own story. It's its own epic tales that just happen to tie into the same world as the Lord of the Rings. Um, Shoot, there was one other thing you mentioned that I was going to comment on, but I can't recall.
There's one thing I always found interesting about what's in the Silmarillion and kind of the backstory, and the history of it, is that Sauron was like, because when we talk about, you talked about like the Dark Lord being there, but that's not actually like the villain of Lord of the Rings, if you want to put it that way. Isn't actually the big bad evil. He's like, to be fair, a servant of his, but he's not actually like the big menace that wrecked everything. He's just a result of it. And so it also kind of like, even though there's this big sense of scale to the Lord of the Rings story, there's also the Silmarillion provided kind of a backdrop to say, well, this isn't necessarily the biggest thing that could have happened, but it was still something that is exciting. I think that feeds into the idea that um, Lord of the Rings as a story wasn't meant to be the be all and end all of everything. It is a passing of an age, and it does have historic significance, but it isn't like the end of the story or the beginning either.
The one thing I will say about the Silmarillion, like obviously its importance in giving us the creation myth, which in turn inspired C.S. Lewis in how Narnia was created, but the whole idea of music being creation. Um, the other thing I will say about it is if you are reading it and you get stuck at chapter 14, you can skip it. It's okay. It's just a description of the map. So if you find that you want to read it and get bored, it's important, but it's not absolutely necessary.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say that after watching the movies when they came out, I of course went to read the Lord of the Rings books, which I was fascinated by, and then I had heard that he'd written this other book called the Silmarillion, or written most of it. And yeah, if there's one thing I remember from the book, as much as I was interested in it for a time, I did find it a bit more legwork to get into it in the same way that I was interested in the Lord of the Rings books.
The Silmarillion does provide kind of a very bit of a very very far back bit of history to the Lord of the Rings, but a lot of the immediate history, like in the Lord of the Rings, you have the countries of Gondor and Arnor, you have the hobbits, and you have places like Rivendell and Lothlorien and Mordor. All that takes place well after their histories. The histories of those places and those peoples take place after the Silmarillion. So when Tolkien wrote the Lord of the Rings, he did have a deep mythology to draw on, but at the same time, he was still creating an awful lot of the more, shall we say, it would be kind of like comparing the history of modern day Europe, uh, and not knowing the history of medieval Europe, but knowing the history of like ancient Europe. So the Silmarillion does provide some backstory. It does kind of tell you who Sauron is. It tells you what the general idea of the elves and the dwarves and men all are in the world, but it doesn't tell you where Rohan came from or where Gondor came from, really. That's all stuff that happens well after the fact. So yeah, it's Silmarillion is a backstory, but not quite to that extent. It's more of this is what happened in the same world, but in a different age.
Yeah, I guess I was imagining it was like a history book that just kind of was explaining different things and events that happened, but it does sound like it's presented more as like like a prose fiction novel, I suppose. So
Yeah, just in our chat, the chat box here, as we're all typing back and forth, somebody made the comment that it seems a bit like reading Genesis in the Bible, and I think actually it's almost like the whole Old Testament in a way. Um, so the Bible, the Old Testament of the Bible has a lot of different styles. Some are real narratives, some are just informative, some are more musical, and I think Silmarillion brings a lot of that. And similar to reading the Old Testament of the Bible, I think if you read the Silmarillion, there's going to be parts of it that you like more than you thought you would. So like it can be a bit of a slog to get into the high mythology, the sort of creation myth at the beginning. It's such a different style that if you're not expecting it, you're not used to it, it can be hard to get into. The more descriptive parts can be a bit of a slog, but there's some incredibly beautiful stories in there that are honestly my favorite parts of the Tolkien mythology that come through. And then they add so much depth to little things in The Lord of the Rings and in The Hobbit that are like they're passing comments, but you realize that for Galadriel to say that this that light that she gives to Sam, the light of Yarendil, our most beloved star, it's a total passing comment, but there's a huge sweeping mythology that is actually part of her family history that like you're like, oh wow, this is a big deal. This is so meaningful and not just sort of a throwaway.
The other connection that would be there, that again is a passing comment, made by Aragorn, and even with, I think Galadriel mentions it, calling Arwen Undomiel the even star. She is the light of Luthien born again. It's one of those things that unless you know who Luthien is and what she was and what she meant to the Elvish people and what her life meant and all of her choices, it's a huge, huge honor and gift, and not just the fact that Aragorn and Arwen are in love and, like the, the couple that brings about the new age of, for lack of a better word, grace within Middle Earth. It's knowing the history of Beren and Luthien and their story and how that fits into everything else and how the world shifts because of their relationship and what they do with recapturing a Silmaril and what those are and how all of that relates to everything else. It's a nice little comment and it's a nice little song that Aragorn sings and in the movies at one point if you're watching the extended editions. But, like if you don't understand what that is, it's like, oh, that's nice. I have no idea what he's talking about. But for the rest, for the bunch of us who do know what that means, it's just like, oh, earth shattering. Like, yes, we need to, okay, yeah, focus, laser focus.
Just to springboard off what Libra was talking about, to give you an idea of the emotion that is in the Silmarillion, Tolkien put on his tombstone, on his wife's tombstone, are the names Beren and Luthien. So those are from those are two characters, an elf and a man from the stories within the Silmarillion, that he connected with so deeply that it was symbolic for him of his own relationship with his wife, which is just really, I think, gives you a sense of the depth to it.
Well, it's like Sam says in a chapter in The Return of the King, when they're dealing with trying to get through Mordor and they're using the elven light that Frodo was given. He comments how they're all one part of one big story, and how the events that they're doing now are connected with the events from the Silmarillion. And I think that's a good point that Tolkien kind of had in there, was that it's all one big interconnected story.
I know we said we were going to talk about movies today, but I feel like I need to talk about this Tolkien movie that was made. I think it was last year. I have not seen it myself because, again, I'm not a huge Lord of the Rings fan, but I did see an article that said that the Tolkien estate essentially disowned the movie. So I'm sure there's some of you here that have seen this movie and have some comments on it, because from my understanding, this is supposed to be like the biopic about Tolkien as an author.
Since childhood, I have been fascinated with language. I want to write legends of my own.
Tell me a story in any language you want.
It's about adventures, the quests we take to prove ourselves.
Stay alive and come back to me.
It's about the deepest parts of the human heart. A magic beyond anything anyone has ever felt before.
Tolkien, rated PG-13, in theaters everywhere, May 10th.
I'll admit to my shame that I have not seen it, just because I probably should not be able to comment too much on it without having seen it. But I intentionally chose not to see it after I saw a preview for it. And the impression I got from that preview was that they were taking extreme liberties with how Tolkien was inspired by events in his life for The Lord of the Rings and for Middle-earth in general. And it just seemed very clear to me that what they were creating was very antithetical to how he actually came about the process, and I figured it wasn't worth my time. But I will admit, I did not actually see it.
Maybe this will be a common theme for us in this section, but I didn't get around to seeing it. We had just moved, actually, just before that came out, so we were in a bit of a busy time in our lives. And by the time I had time to get out and watch it, I also had heard that the Tolkien estate wasn't a big fan. And so if they weren't a fan, I wasn't a fan, so I didn't bother.
I wish I could break tradition here, but I can't. I'm with the other two guys in the sense that I'd heard about it and I will probably check it out at one point, but I have also not seen it. From what I heard, like, it didn't. The people that did see it, the few that did see it, thought it was okay. But, and just to be on the safe side here, as not to spoil it for anyone, there's a big part of Tolkien's upbringing that they did not feature in the movie at all. And I think for me, that was kind of one less reason to see the movie. And to be fair, like, I can't judge the movie until I've seen it, so I will check it out at some point. But knowing that they kind of left a certain important part out was, I was not too excited about that.
I wish I could break the trend and tell you, actually, I've seen it. It's great. I haven't seen it. Yeah, definitely heard the same things, that Tolkien's estate didn't approve of it, and yeah, okay, that's enough of a reason for me that I'm not interested in. And as much as I love the actors who are in it, I don't know if I'll ever see it unless somebody else kind of forces me to.
Just to make a comment for the listeners, when we speak about the Tolkien estate, specifically at the time, Tolkien's son, Christopher Tolkien, who compiled the Silmarillion and a lot of other posthumous works of Tolkien, was still alive, and he was still kind of the main guy in charge of Tolkien's estate. So when we say the Tolkien estate didn't approve of it, we specifically mean people of Tolkien's family who knew him and who knew probably better than anyone what Tolkien's life was like. And so we're not just saying, it's some stodgy company that happens to own the rights to this thing that didn't like it. We're saying no, like people who actually know the real story didn't like it.
Sounds like this will be a great episode for the Bat Jar to get everyone here to rip into that movie eventually. So we'll log that for future reference. We're not going to get nearly through half the things that I would thought we could talk about this time. I underestimated the sheer amount of knowledge that goes into learning about the Lord of the Rings as a franchise. So maybe as a way to kind of conclude our episode for today, it'd be nice to hear from everyone. What is maybe the one element of the Lord of the Rings that has had the most impact on you, or perhaps what you think J.R.R Tolkien's biggest impact has been on nerd and geek culture as a whole?
I would say, and of course, I'm going to kind of talk about the movies here because they're what I'm most knowledgeable about, but I guess I'll include the books as well. That I think the books leading to the movies and the movies themselves have had such an influence in pop culture since they came out in 2001, 2002, and 2003 that kind of similar with what happened with Star Wars is, in the late 60s, early 70s, like you had science fiction movies coming out, but then Star Wars comes along as the big game changer, and there was just so many more sci-fi movies that came out after Star Wars. And I think a similar thing happened with Lord of the Rings because there were fantasy movies that were being made before Lord of the Rings, but once the trilogy came out, especially once Fellowship came out and was the smashing success that it understandably was, you started seeing all these other fantasy stories and fantasy movies, right? I don't think Chronicles of Narnia would have happened if Lord of the Rings was a flop. Like you have that, you have a whole bunch of other fantasy movies, and Libra and I were talking just the other day, and she even made a good point that we might not have gotten something like Game of Thrones, which has also become a bit of a game changer when it comes to fantasy TV shows. So I think Lord of the Rings has in so many different ways influenced pop culture. I mean, it influenced me, and some of the friends that I'm still making films with today were also influenced by Lord of the Rings. So it's truly incredible what the books and what the movies have done for really the world.
For me, I think the piece of Tolkien history and mythology that has resonated with me the most is just the characters, the aspirational heroism that they lived out of was, I think, for me, in a particularly formative part of my life. Um, Gave me some heroes, like similar to a lot of superhero. I think people with their comic books growing up, they see their superheroes and they want to be like them. A lot of those epic heroes of the Tolkien universe are what really captured my imagination as a young man. And to be honest, I'd say to this day help shape the person I'm trying to become. Um, the type of person who is willing to lay it all on the line and do something worthwhile to make the world a better place, or to combat evil forces that might force the world back into darkness. Now, I don't quite have the stage that any of his characters have, but I'm trying to live that out in my own life, and I think that's been the case for a lot of people. It's given people a reason to keep pushing and to try to be better.
I would say what's the biggest impact on me, and I think as possibly one of the bigger impacts on the world as well, is that the concept of world building, of having, of when you tell a story, you don't just have it in a vacuum. You have it in a world that is interconnected, that has some coherence and logic to it, and has a huge backstory that explains all the different parts that exist in the world at the time of the story. I think that was highly influential on the world. You haven't necessarily seen too many people emulate that, but it's something that's in the back of everyone's mind. It's like a better story often will have a better backstory. And for me, like in everything that I've done, story creation wise, it's always been something that I've wanted to incorporate and has been huge. Like I remember as a kid, like after coming to understand the Lord of the Rings, you could see it just reflected in the way that we like played Lego, even like all our different characters kind of more integrated into a solid world. And any kind of story that we as kids created, and even now that I like to think about creating. it's the concept of having a whole legend, a whole mythology, a whole interconnected world beyond just the story that you're reading or creating. And so whenever I read, I'm always more attracted to stories that have that, and that's part of the reason why I like things like the Marvel movies, because they are interconnected. They build on each other. They create a larger mythos than beyond just a single story.
Other than influencing me to write my own stories and again, yeah, world building and creating characters and showing the struggle of a very like human sort of existence, even if they are elves and dwarves and hobbits and everything else. Like the the aspirations, the hope, the faith, all of those things are very, very real and part of the human experience, and that's why we love the characters so much. But to me, it's also the power of myth in and of itself. I don't know if I assume most people here, or at least some of the listeners, have read the poem Mythopoeia, and if you haven't, you really should. It's beautiful. Tolkien and Lewis were arguing one night about um, myth and what it does, and Lewis said that myths were lies, though breathed through silver. And Tolkien was very upset with him because he believed that myths have more truth in them, even if it's hidden under the guise of fantasy creatures or, like lightsaber duels or whatever, like comic book heroes, like the struggle of Captain America, like that moment when he picks up his shield and straps it back on and keeps going. Like it's all of these things that speak to us about human life and human existence. Like that's, yes, they're breathed through silver, but there's still so much more truth in them than a lot of the other stories we might hear in a day. And it's that sort of thing that keeps me coming back to Tolkien.
And even though I don't have this connection to the Lord of the Rings, I can acknowledge that if it had not come out when it did, so much of what I enjoy would not exist today. I think one work of fiction that I think definitely got impacted by Tolkien's writing was the comic book series Watchmen, because that is a limited story that takes place in its own world, and there's so much work that's put into building the history of that world and like the fiction within that world. They flip there's like segments of like of a comic book within the comic book that's included in the series. There's excerpts of like a person's biography that you can read as well. It really shows that it's a lived in world, which is obviously it's something that would not have happened if Tolkien had not taken the approach he had taken to doing Lord of the Rings, and certainly the way it has influenced what we consider the fantasy genre now. That's a genre of anime I really enjoy watching, so I have to acknowledge that Tolkien had a role in that as well. And I think this just sort of reminds me that this is such an important topic when it comes to nerdy geek culture that this can be easily several episodes. So I think for today we're going to kind of wrap it up there, and just to emphasize, if you have any interest in Lord of the Rings, you have any interest in fantasy or good world building, go and read the books. It might be a little challenging for you depending on your reading level, but they're all available. I would certainly recommend reading them. And we'll definitely bring this fellowship together again to talk about other aspects of the Lord of the Rings franchise. Normally, we would now go into the bat jar and look at our mail, but we don't have any mail this week.
If you want to reach the show, you can send us an email at
batjarpodcast@gmail.com.
message us on Facebook or message us on Twitter at
The Bat Cookie Jar.
You can find the Bat Jar Podcast in whatever platform you listen to podcasts, including YouTube. Please give us a rating, write reviews for our shows, and share our posts on social media. This will help us to bring all people inside the Bat Jar.
And now is when we would normally go inside the bat jar to pull a topic out for next time. But sadly, I am away from the bat jar studio and I don't have the bat jar. So we'll look at scheduling. We'll see what happens. We might end up doing like a news episode next week because we have not talked about any news in some time. And it's in our theme song that we talk about nerdy and geeky news. So we might have to do that. And depending on if members of the Fellowship are available, maybe we'll continue talking about Lord of the Rings. Who knows? So come back to the Bat Sharp podcast next week for something. Who knows at this point? And if you're listening to this in the future, you'll already know what the next episode is because it's available. And until that time, I'm Average Joe.
Ribs. Beef pork ribs.
I'm Ben the Movie Buff.
I'm Libra the Book Lady.
I'm Rune Reimer.
And I'm Shaggy Neo.
Catch you on the flip side.
See you later.
See you in the next one.
See you between the books.
Well, goodbye.
Until next time, keep fit and have fun.